Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. In today's tutorial video, I'm going to show you how you can draw a realistic eye study like the one that I have drawn here. So I think that eyes are one of the most important aspects of a portrait, and they're also good to draw as a small study like this. So it's good if you're a beginner, if you're an intermediate or expert and want to improve your skills as well. So let's get straight into this tutorial, and one of the first things that I've done is just taken a really sharp dark sepia pencil and I've just outlined all of the most important aspects of that left hand eye. So I've gone around the iris, I've gone around the sort of waterline, and I've also marked around the pupil as well. And one of the first things that I've done on my example is actually use an embossing tool to indent the paper to highlight some of those really white hairs coming over the eye. So I've just used an embossing tool before I've gone around the top of the eye with that dark sepia, and I've used that embossing tool first because then it indents the paper and the colour doesn't go into those grooves, whereas if I was to use an embossing tool after I'd done some colour, it really wouldn't work. So to get those really white lines on that eye, what I've done is just use that embossing tool and I've pushed quite hard onto the paper so it indents, so that the colour sort of resists when I go back over with subsequent colours. After I've done that, then I just go around and flesh in some of those darker parts. So I just use light pressure on that dark sepia pencil and just add in a light layer of colour just to sort of get those shapes right and make sure that everything's sitting correct. And then I'll go in with another layer and a little bit of harder pressure and just sort of reaffirm those shapes and really get that dark colour down. Then it's time to turn our attention to the iris. So one of the first things that I've done is just put a really light base layer down of some warm grey 1. And when I'm putting down that base layer, I'm just using really small circular motions with my pencil, and I'm doing that so that I can fill in as much of the tooth of the paper as possible, and so that I can get a nice smooth even layer as well. And it really helps to have a sharp pencil when you're doing that so that you can get that even smooth coverage. I've used small circular motions as well because the iris tends to be quite smooth, and if I was to just shade back and forth, I'd kind of get a liney texture, which I kind of want to avoid because the eye is really shiny and it's really smooth. So I've just used really small circular motions to try and fill in as much of that tooth of the paper as possible. So then what I've done is used some green colours, so I've worked from my lightest colours to my darkest colours, and I've just used those in exactly the same motion as I have for that base layer. I've just used those really small circular motions just to really get that colour down onto that paper in a really nice smooth and even way. So I've worked from my lightest green to my darkest green, and I've also added a few browns in there as well, just for some of the shadows around the outside of the eye. So you can see on the eye that I've kept the inner section next to the pupil, I've kept that quite light, and that's where you've got a lot of the light hitting the eye. And then those areas around that, I've added quite a lot of shadow, and there's often quite a lot of shadow on that upper eyelid, so I've added some browns and even gone in there with some dark sepia to really darken that up to create that shadow on the top of the eye. And also similarly around the very edges of the iris as well, I've added those browns and that dark sepia to create that shadow and to create a three-dimensional look. And I've kept the very middle of the eye really light, and that just helps to make it look really three-dimensional. And all throughout that, I've just used those small circular motions to really fill in that paper and to get that smooth glassy look that you can see developing there. I've also used a little bit of blue for a little bit of interest in colour within the eye, and that just helps to create that sort of highlight, and it makes it look really shiny as well. Every now and then I've gone in with a Caran d'Ache Luminance white pencil and I've just burnished out ever so slightly. I haven't used much pressure when I've burnished, and it just helps to smooth all of those colours together and helps to create that really smooth glassy look that you really want to achieve with eyes. I've then gone in and added some details, so you can see a few lines within an iris if you really study it. They tend to come out from the pupil out towards the very edges of the iris. So all I've done for that is just use a really sharp pencil, and then I've just come from the pupil and then brought some really faint lines out towards the outer edge of the iris and sort of spiraled them around the pupil as well. And that just creates that little bit of texture in there. If you was to study an eye, you would realise that there is quite a bit of texture underneath that sort of glassy exterior, so it's really good to add a little bit of that texture through there just by making some small lines coming out from the pupil towards the edge of the iris. On cat's eyes, you tend to get these really weird wiggly sort of snake lines around the edges as well. So I've just used a sharp brown pencil and added those little wiggly lines in. And I've also added a few spots of brown which was flecked through there as well. So I've just used a sharp pencil and I've just shaded very lightly on top of those. So all I've done is just used a really sharp brown pencil to add some of those small areas of texture and everything in there, those little shapes that you can see around the outside. I've just used a really sharp pencil, just laid it very lightly on top of those existing layers, and then I've gone in with a bit of a harder pressure to really add those shapes in and to really get that definition into the eye. For the sort of tear duct area at the right of the eye, all I've done is just lightly layered some dark sepia, so one of my darkest pencils, and then I've added some different colours in there. So I've just lightly layered some burnt sienna, some purple, so some manganese violet, and a little bit of blue. I've just layered those on top of that initial layer of dark sepia just to sort of give it a little bit of depth and a little bit of interest, and then I've further layered some more dark sepia on to really darken that up, because that bit on my reference photo was really quite dark. So I've just gone back over, once I've added those few colours in there, gone back over with that dark sepia just to create a really nice dark edge to that, and you can see that adding those colours in just gives it a lot more interest and it makes it look a lot more realistic. After I've completed all the iris and all of those details within the eye, I've then gone around and done some fur work. So the fur on this cat was actually ginger and white, and these are two types of fur that I often get asked how I render, so I thought this would be really perfect for a tutorial. So for the ginger fur, what I've done is laid down a layer of warm grey one, and what I've done is really studied my reference photo. So I've really looked at the direction that all of that fur was going. I've noted any sort of fur changes. I've really looked at it, and then I've gone in with my warm grey one, so my base layer, and I've used really light pressure and just shaded down that colour in the direction that all that fur is going. So every now and then I will look at my reference photo and make sure that I am shading in the correct direction. So for this cat, the fur on the top of the head was sort of coming up towards where the ears would be, and then as you come around to the left hand side of the eye it was coming off towards the left, and then of course underneath the eye it was coming down and to the left as well. So I've just made sure that I have followed the reference photo, I've put that base layer down in the correct way, and then that really helps when you're adding those further layers, because once you've got that initial base layer down of that fur direction, you don't need to pay that much attention when you're adding your subsequent layers, because you've already mapped out that direction, you've already done the hard work for yourself. So then what I've done is gone over with some of my orange and yellows. So I've actually added a really light layer of light yellow ochre, so I've shaded that over the top of that warm grey one, and then I've sort of burnished it out a little bit with the white pencil as well. And then I've gone in and started to layer from my lightest colours to my darkest colours. So to create this ginger fur, what I've done is added a layer of the brown ochre, and I've sort of mapped out the darkest areas within the fur first. So off to the left hand side of the eye there's a dark patch there, so I've just lightly shaded the brown ochre, and then what I've done is gone in and added some fur lines on top of that. So I've used the pencil to create some shading first to create that initial shape, and then I've gone in and added the fur to blend it out into the surrounding areas and to create that really nice soft fluffy look as well. So to create those fur lines, all I've done is just put my pencil onto the paper, looked at the direction that the fur is going in and moved my pencil in that direction using really light pressure. And then as I've come towards the end of the length of the fur stroke, I've lifted my pencil off, so you create this really nice tapered edge, and that really softens the edge as well, so it's not really harsh, and that creates that really soft fluffy look. So I've used those lines over the top of that shading to really blend it into the surrounding areas. And then what I've done is gradually got darker with my colours, so I've gone from the brown ochre, I've then used burnt ochre, terracotta, and then finally burnt sienna. And I've added the burnt sienna in exactly the same way. I've just added some shading down in those darker areas and then added those fur strokes and blended it out into the surrounding areas, so you get this really, really nice soft transition between that light and that dark fur. So I've just applied that technique around the entire ginger fur, and then where you've got the white fur that meets that ginger fur, I've actually used the embossing tool once more to add some really white hairs that are overlapping that ginger fur. So before I've gone into the white and before I've added the edges of that ginger where it meets that white, all I've done is just use that embossing tool to create really fine lines where it's overlapping. So I've used two sizes with my embossing tool. I've used a 0.6mm and a 1.5mm on there, and all I've done is just use that in exactly the same way that I would hold a pencil, and I've used it in exactly the same way as how I would create a fur line. So I've sort of put it down onto the paper, and then as I'm drawing the fur line, I'm lifting the pressure off so you get that nice tapered edge, and I've used that in exactly the same way for those fur lines. Once those embossed lines are down, then I'm free to add all of that white fur. So for the white fur, it's not actually just one colour. I've added a whole load of colours into that white fur, and what I've done is put down a layer of warm grey one to begin with. Again, I've made that base layer using some shading marks. I've gone back and forth with the pencil, and I've followed that fur direction. So I've looked at the reference photo and I've seen which direction and where the sort of fur changes are, and I've layered that initial base layer down of that warm grey one in that direction. I've then gone in and added a further layer of the warm grey one to add in some of those darker areas. So the main dark areas on this eye study were between the eyes on the bridge of the nose. So what I've done is just gone in with another layer of the warm grey one. I've also used another grey pencil, the cold grey one, to add a little bit of difference in there. And I've just layered the pencil down in exactly the same way as I had with those base layers, just following the fur direction using really light pressure and a sharp pencil to get that colour down. Then what I've done is gone in with some mid-tone values for the white fur. So instead of shading, what I've done is actually started to use some fur lines. And I've used those fur lines because it gives a softer effect. And the fur is actually still quite white, so I don't really want to shade down a brown area or any kind of weird colour. I don't really want to shade it down. I've just used some really small lines of that colour to give the effect that there is that shadow and to really affirm the bone structure on the face there. So I've used some nougat for this, just used some small lines. I've also used some yellow, some purple, some blue. I've used some various colours to create the tones within the fur here. And then what I've done is gone in with the dark sepia. And this might seem like a bit of a weird colour to use on white fur, but it really creates a really nice shadow. So I've gone in with some dark sepia and added really tiny fur lines on the bridge of the nose and around the eyes here because the fur is really quite short. So one of the main features on this eye study was the fact that it had short hair on the nose, and then around the eyes the fur was really quite long, so you had that difference between the long and short fur. So around the eyes I was using quite long strokes with the pencil, whereas on the nose and everything I was using really short, like almost sort of pinprick points with the pencil to try and create that sort of texture. So I've just used that dark sepia pencil to create the darker shadows and everything within that fur. I've also burnished a little bit of the white pencil on here because when you burnish over with the white pencil on the dark sepia, it gives a really lovely tone, and it was perfect for this. So I've just gone in with the white pencil and burnished over a little bit, and it sort of smoothed everything out, and then I've gone in with another layer of the dark sepia, so that really dark pencil, and added in some more fur lines to really get the texture of the fur down. So when I've gone in with these darker colours on this white fur, I haven't gone in with hard pressure at all. I've gone in with really super light pressure. I've hardly pushed onto my pencil at all and just sort of let the pressure of the pencil do the work on the drawing for me. So I've sort of held my pencil against the paper and just really lightly moved it and added those fur lines, added that shading and all that kind of thing. So I haven't used very much pressure at all. Even when I was burnishing, I wasn't pushing that hard with the white pencil. So once I've done that white fur, I've then gone in and started the right hand eye. So on this example, the right hand eye and the right hand side of this face was a lot darker than the left hand side. So I've had to go in with a lot more layers and a little bit more pressure to try and get the sort of depth and the darkness that I wanted to achieve on that side. So for the eye, I've gone through exactly the same process. All I've done is outlined everything. I've outlined the iris, outlined sort of the eyelids and the tear duct and all of those kinds of thing, and then I've gone in and added the base layer to the eye using those really small circular motions to create a really smooth surface, and then I've slowly built up from those lighter greens to those darker greens. And on this side of the face and this eye I've added a lot more brown, so I've added a lot more nougat, a lot more burnt sienna, and a whole lot more dark sepia. But I've used exactly the same process throughout. I've just used those really small circular motions to really fill the tooth of the paper and to get a really smooth look. I've done exactly the same as the left hand eye as well, and just gone in with a sharp dark pencil and just added a little bit of texture. So I've added some of those lines coming out from the pupil towards the outer edges of the iris, and some of those little sort of textured lines around the very outside. You've got those wiggly lines. And for the highlight in this, I just used really hard pressure on my Caran d'Ache Luminance white pencil to really get that white bit down. There wasn't much of a highlight in this, so I didn't have to use too much pressure or worry about leaving any areas too white, but I just went over and just burnished a little bit of that white pencil to really get that highlight in. And around the highlights on the eyes, I also added a layer of the dark sepia, and I've just gone around the highlight there, and that's just to really hype up the contrast between that light and that dark. If you've got a really light area and you add dark right next to it, it really makes that lighter area really white and light. So I've just gone around the highlights, gone around those lighter areas with that dark pencil, just to sort of hype up the contrast between them and to really make them stick out. Once I've done the eye and I've got it as dark as I need to, it's quite a bit of effort with this one, I've then gone in and done exactly the same process as the left hand side with the ginger fur. So I've added the base layer, mapped out all of the fur direction and everything with the warm grey one, and then I've gone in with some light yellow ochre for that initial sort of yellowy colour layer, and then I've started to add my oranges. So I've gone in with the lighter orange, the brown ochre, and then slowly built my way up to the burnt sienna. So I've been using a combination of the shading to get that initial colour down, and then using the fur lines to sort of soften everything together, and then following the fur lines through the rest of the fur as well to create that really nice soft fluffy look. And then on the underneath of the eye, it's a lot darker than the left hand side, so I've just added more layers of those darker pencils to really get those shadows and everything down. Throughout the ginger parts on this eye study, I've also added a little hint of purple, and by adding a little bit of purple next to the orange or yellow parts, it really makes them stand out. So if you were to look at a colour wheel, you would notice that orange and purple work really well together. If you put them together, they sort of bounce off each other and bring a certain sort of vibrancy to each other. So adding purple next to that orange really makes it stand out and really makes it vibrant. So I've just added a little bit of manganese violet next to some of those really sort of orange tones, just to really complement it and to really make it jump out at you. So that's pretty much it for this tutorial. I think eye studies are one of the best things that you can do to improve your skills. Even if you are an intermediate or expert and you do an eye study, you might think that it's a little bit like boring or a little bit lame, but coming and doing an eye study, it really does help you improve your skills. I've learned a lot of things from this eye study that I will apply to my future work. So I think they're really important and really fundamental, and as I said, the eyes of a portrait really draw you in, so it's really important to study that and to get that right. If you want to follow this tutorial along in real time, then I do have a 4-hour version available to subscribers to my website. I'll leave a link in the description and a card up above if you want to go and check that out and follow along with me in real time. Hopefully you've enjoyed this short tutorial and this eye study. If you have, then give it a thumbs up and comment down below if you'd like to see future smaller studies like this. So perhaps you'd like to see some other eyes, maybe noses, that kind of thing. Leave me a comment down below of what you would like to see small study tutorials on. If you're new around here and you really like this video, then make sure that you hit that subscribe button. I post tutorial videos every single Friday. I post art advice every single Wednesday, and every other Sunday there is a potluck video for you. So make sure you hit that subscribe button and tick that bell icon as well so you don't miss out on all of my future content. But anyway guys, I'll see you in my next video. Bye!